The cruelest people rarely expect someone important to be watching. The crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across the ballroom, turning every polished glass into a tiny star. Soft piano music floated through the air while conversations about charity, investments, and weekend vacations blended into a polished performance that looked generous from a distance. I balanced a silver tray filled with sparkling water and fresh champagne flutes, weaving carefully between elegantly dressed guests who barely noticed I existed. At 31 years old, I had learned that invisibility could sometimes make a difficult job easier. I worked 2 housekeeping jobs during the week and accepted catering events on weekends because raising an 8-year-old daughter alone meant every extra dollar mattered. Emma believed I worked at beautiful parties because I liked pretty dresses and fancy buildings. I never had the heart to tell her the black uniform hanging in my closet was simply another way to keep our lights on every month. The charity gala occupied one of the city's most luxurious private estates, surrounding an enormous swimming pool that reflected strings of white lights stretching between tall palm trees. Everything looked perfect. Fresh flowers lined the marble walkways. Servers moved silently with practiced smiles. Guests laughed just loudly enough to be noticed. From a distance, kindness appeared to be the theme of the evening. Up close, it felt very different. "Excuse me," a woman called sharply as I passed with my tray. I turned immediately. 2 elegantly dressed ladies stood beside the pool, wearing designer gowns that probably cost more than my car. Diamond bracelets sparkled around their wrists as they studied me with expressions that carried polite smiles but cold eyes. "Would you bring us fresh towels?" one asked. "Of course," I answered. I set my tray down nearby and hurried toward the towel station before returning less than a minute later. "Thank you," the taller woman said sweetly, accepting the folded towel without looking at it. Then she frowned dramatically. "Oh dear, this one has a wrinkle." Before I could apologize or offer another, the second woman laughed softly. Maybe she cannot see it. A few nearby guests glanced in our direction. I lowered my eyes and calmly reached for a replacement. "I am sorry. Let me bring you another." As I stepped closer, the taller woman shifted sideways just enough for her shoulder to brush firmly against mine. The movement seemed accidental for only a fraction of a second. My shoes slipped against the smooth stone surrounding the pool. The tray slid from my hands. Glasses clinked loudly. Cold water splashed upward as I lost my balance and fell into the deep blue pool below. The icy shock stole my breath. For one long moment, all I heard was the muffled sound of water surrounding me before I pushed myself back toward the surface. When I finally emerged, soaking wet from head to toe, scattered laughter echoed around the courtyard. Someone whispered that I should have been more careful. Another person shook their head with embarrassed amusement before returning to their conversation as though nothing important had happened. My uniform clung heavily to my skin while water dripped from my sleeves onto the marble deck. Every instinct told me to disappear before the tears gathering in my eyes became visible. Instead, I quietly climbed out of the pool without saying a single angry word. I picked up the empty tray, gathered the unbroken glasses one by one, and whispered a sincere apology even though I had done nothing wrong. The 2 women exchanged satisfied smiles before turning back toward the party. They believed the moment had already ended. They never looked toward the second-floor balcony overlooking the courtyard. Hidden behind the soft glow of the ballroom windows, one man had witnessed every second from beginning to end, and unlike everyone else that evening, he had not laughed once. My wet shoes echoed quietly against the marble floor as I carried the empty tray toward the service hallway. Every step left small pools of water behind me, yet no one offered a towel, no one asked whether I was all right, and no one questioned what had really happened beside the pool. The gala simply continued as though humiliation had become another form of entertainment. I reached the staff entrance and finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands trembled from the cold, but I refused to cry. Emma would be waiting for me at home with homework spread across the kitchen table and 100 questions about the beautiful party where Mommy worked. She deserved a mother who came home smiling, not broken. I found a stack of clean towels beside the laundry room and quietly wrapped one around my shoulders before helping another server gather the glasses that had survived the fall. "You did not deserve that," she whispered without looking directly at me. I forced a small smile. "It is over now." She shook her head gently. People like them always believe they can treat others that way. Before I could answer, Mrs. Reynolds, the catering supervisor, hurried into the hallway. I expected a lecture about the broken glasses or ruined uniform. Instead, she stopped in front of me with an expression I could not quite read. "Olivia," she said softly, "someone is asking for you." I looked down at my soaked clothes. "Right now?" "Yes." "Who?" She hesitated. I was not given a name. I assumed one of the event organizers wanted another apology or expected me to sign paperwork for damaged equipment. Quietly, I followed her through a private corridor lined with paintings and polished wood doors until we reached a small elevator reserved for the estate's upper floor. "Second level," Mrs. Reynolds said. "The security team will meet you there." My heartbeat quickened. Security usually meant trouble, and tonight already felt heavy enough. The elevator doors opened into a peaceful hallway far removed from the crowded ballroom below. Thick carpets softened every footstep. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glowing courtyard where guests still laughed beneath strings of white lights surrounding the pool. Two men in dark tailored suits waited outside a set of double doors. Neither looked angry. One of them simply nodded respectfully before opening the door for me. "Please," he said. "He is waiting." I stepped inside expecting another office or conference room. Instead, I found a spacious private lounge overlooking the entire gala through a wall of glass. A fire burned quietly inside a stone fireplace, warming the room with soft amber light. Standing near the window was the same man I had noticed only for a brief second before leaving the courtyard. Tall, calm, dark hair brushed neatly back. His tailored black suit fit perfectly across broad shoulders, and when he turned toward me, the sleeve of his jacket shifted just enough to reveal the edge of intricate tattoos disappearing beneath crisp white cuffs. His gray eyes met mine without judgment, without amusement, and without the uncomfortable pity I had grown used to receiving after difficult moments. For several quiet seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he picked up a neatly folded white towel from the arm of a leather chair and walked toward me. Instead of handing it to an assistant or placing it on a table, he gently offered it directly to me. "You should not have had to stand there alone," he said quietly. His voice carried neither anger nor sympathy, only certainty. I accepted the towel with hesitant hands, still unsure who this stranger was, or why the most powerful-looking man in the entire building seemed far more disturbed by what had happened than anyone who had actually been standing beside the pool. For a long moment, I simply stood there holding the warm towel against my soaked uniform, unsure whether to thank him or apologize for interrupting whatever important meeting had brought him to the balcony overlooking the gala. He seemed completely unconcerned by either possibility. His attention remained on me with a calm focus that made the silence feel strangely comfortable. "Please sit down," he said, motioning toward a chair near the fireplace. I hesitated. I should probably return to work. He looked toward the ballroom below, where music still drifted through the open terrace doors. "The event will continue without you for 5 minutes." Something in the quiet confidence of his voice made arguing seem unnecessary. I carefully sat down, wrapping the towel more tightly around my shoulders while the warmth from the fire slowly chased away the chill that had settled deep into my bones. He poured a cup of hot tea and placed it on the table beside me before taking the chair across from mine. "My name is Luca DeLuca," he said simply. The name meant nothing to me at first, but I noticed the subtle reaction from the two security men standing outside the room. Even they carried themselves differently around him, with the effortless respect people gave someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Olivia Carter," I replied quietly. He nodded once, as though he had already known. I watched everything that happened by the pool. My fingers tightened slightly around the warm cup. "Then you know it was just an accident." He held my gaze for several silent seconds before answering. "No." There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. "I know it was not." I looked down at the steam rising from the tea. "It does not matter anymore." "It matters." I managed a tired smile. "Only if someone is willing to care." Another quiet pause settled between us. Finally, he asked the question I least expected. "Why did you apologize?" I frowned in confusion. "For dropping the tray." "You did not drop it by choice." I searched for the right words. Sometimes apologizing is easier than arguing with people who have already decided you are wrong. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was not pity. It was disappointment, though not directed at me. "Do you always solve problems that way?" I thought about Emma waiting at home, about rent due next week, about the second job that helped pay for school supplies and groceries. I solved them the way that lets me keep feeding my daughter. The room became completely still. He leaned back slightly, studying me with quiet curiosity. You have a daughter. I smiled despite my exhaustion. 8 years old. She believes I work around beautiful people every weekend. A faint smile finally reached his eyes. Does she know what happened tonight? She never will if I can help it. He nodded slowly, almost respectfully. You are protecting her. That is my job. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the illuminated pool where the party continued exactly as before. The two women laughed with another group of guests, completely unaware that anyone had questioned their version of events. Luca remained silent for a long moment before turning back toward me. Miss Carter, he said quietly, would you allow me to ask you one more question? I nodded. If someone offered you money for what happened tonight, would you accept it? I answered without needing even a second to think. No. Why? I looked directly into his eyes. Because respect is not something anyone can buy after they watched it disappear. For the first time since we met, Luca did not answer immediately. Instead, the smallest hint of admiration crossed his face, and I realized that whatever he had expected to find when he invited me upstairs, it had not been the woman now sitting across from him. When I finally returned downstairs, the gala looked exactly as it had before I disappeared. Crystal glasses still sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Guests continued smiling for photographers. Waiters moved gracefully between marble columns carrying silver trays as though nothing uncomfortable had interrupted the evening. The only difference was the dry uniform beneath my borrowed blazer and the unexpected calm settling inside my heart. I finished the remainder of my shift without another incident. The two women who had laughed beside the pool never looked in my direction again. Shortly before midnight, I quietly clocked out, picked up my worn canvas bag, and drove home through nearly empty streets. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for me, still clutching the storybook we had been reading together. I gently carried her to bed before sitting alone at the tiny kitchen table with a cup of reheated tea. My phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Reynolds. Thank you for your professionalism tonight. I smiled faintly. Professionalism was a polite word people often used when they expected someone to endure humiliation without complaint. The next morning sunlight filtered through our apartment window while Emma ate cereal before school. Did the princesses have a nice party? She asked with innocent curiosity. I looked at her bright smile and nodded. Some people did. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I like it better here. I laughed softly. So do I. After dropping Emma at school, I returned to my housekeeping job at a small office building downtown. By lunchtime, I had almost convinced myself the previous evening belonged in the past. Then Mrs. Reynolds called. Olivia, she said carefully, someone has been asking about you. My shoulders tensed. Who? Mr. DeLuca's office. I closed my eyes for a brief second. Did I do something wrong? Actually, no. She sounded almost amused. He requested your employment records only to make sure he had the correct address to send something. Please tell him I cannot accept expensive gifts. Mrs. Reynolds laughed quietly. I had a feeling you would say that. The conversation ended, and I returned to work, believing that would be the last I heard from Luca. I was wrong. 2 evenings later, after finishing my shift, I found a plain white envelope tucked beneath my apartment door. There was no company logo, no expensive stationery, and no signature on the outside. Inside rested a handwritten note in elegant script. Miss Carter, I have no intention of purchasing your gratitude. You made that very clear. However, there is something I believe belongs to you. If you are willing, please meet me tomorrow afternoon at the DeLuca Foundation Community Center. There was also a simple address and nothing more. Curiosity stayed with me all evening. The following afternoon, I arrived at the community center expecting another formal conversation. Instead, I found dozens of children laughing in bright classrooms while volunteers organized donated school supplies and families lined up for free meals. The building buzzed with warmth rather than luxury. Luca stood near the entrance wearing a simple navy sweater instead of an expensive suit, speaking with elderly volunteers as though they had known one another for years. When he noticed me, he smiled and walked over carrying a folder. Welcome, he said. This is what I wanted you to see. He handed me the folder. Inside were photographs, financial reports, and volunteer schedules showing years of educational scholarships, food programs, and housing assistance funded quietly through the foundation. I looked up in surprise. You wanted me to know this? He nodded. Last night you said respect cannot be bought. His expression remained calm and sincere. I agreed. It has to be earned. I thought you deserved to know who I really am before believing everything people say about me. For the next several weeks, I found myself returning to the community center whenever my schedule allowed. At first, I volunteered only on Saturday mornings while Emma attended the children's reading program held in one of the brightly painted classrooms upstairs. It gave us both something to look forward to after long work weeks. Emma quickly made friends with the volunteers, and before long she knew every hallway, every bookshelf, and every smiling face inside the building. She especially liked helping organize donated backpacks before the new school semester. Luca was there almost every weekend, though never in the way I expected. Instead of giving speeches or standing in front of cameras, he quietly carried heavy boxes into storage rooms, repaired broken tables, and listened patiently whenever someone needed advice. One afternoon, I watched him kneel beside an elderly man struggling to assemble a wheelchair ramp outside the entrance. Without removing his jacket or calling for help, Luca picked up a wrench and worked beside him until the ramp was finished. Nobody applauded. Nobody even seemed surprised. It was simply another ordinary afternoon for him. He does that every week, one volunteer whispered as she handed me another box of books. People only notice his reputation. They rarely notice his weekends. Those words stayed with me. The more time I spent there, the harder it became to reconcile the rumors surrounding Luca with the man I actually knew. One Saturday, Emma came running across the courtyard carrying a handmade drawing. "Mom," she called excitedly. "Look what I made." The picture showed 3 people standing beneath a bright yellow sun. One wore a simple blue dress. Another wore a dark suit with colorful tattoos peeking out from his sleeves. Between them stood a little girl holding both of their hands. Across the top, she had written in careful block letters, "Helping people makes families bigger." I smiled as I admired her work. "It is beautiful." She grinned proudly before running toward Luca. "Can I show him too?" "Of course." Luca looked up from planting flowers near the entrance as Emma handed him the drawing. He studied it carefully, smiling more with his eyes than his lips. "Who are these people?" he asked gently. Emma pointed without hesitation. "That is Mommy. That is me. And that is you because you help everybody." Luca remained unusually quiet. After Emma skipped away to join the other children, he folded the drawing carefully instead of placing it aside. "She sees the world differently," he said softly. "Children usually do," I replied. "They notice hearts before titles." He looked at me with quiet gratitude. I wish more adults remembered how. As the afternoon came to an end, several families lined up to receive grocery boxes prepared by the volunteers. I noticed Luca standing slightly behind the tables, allowing everyone else to hand out the food while he quietly restocked supplies from the storage room whenever something ran low. He never positioned himself at the center of attention. He simply made certain no one left empty-handed. Driving home that evening, Emma looked out the car window before asking a question only a child could ask so honestly. "Mom, if someone is kind when nobody is watching, does that mean they are really kind?" I glanced toward the fading sunset stretching across the highway and smiled to myself. "Yes," I answered. "That is exactly what it means." At that moment, I realized I was no longer trying to decide whether I should trust Luca de Luca. Without noticing it, I already had. Autumn arrived quietly, covering the trees surrounding the community center with shades of amber and gold. Saturday mornings had become a tradition neither Emma nor I ever questioned anymore. We packed homemade muffins before sunrise, stopped by the local bakery for fresh bread, and spent most of the day helping wherever another pair of hands was needed. The volunteers no longer introduced us as visitors. They simply smiled and said, "Good morning," as though we had always belonged there. Luca was already arranging tables in the courtyard when we arrived one cool October morning. He had traded his tailored suits for a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled above his forearms, revealing the familiar tattoos that no longer intimidated me. Instead, they reminded me that every person carried chapters the world rarely understood. Emma ran straight toward him carrying a small pumpkin she had painted with bright orange flowers and a smiling face. "This one is for your office," she announced proudly. Luca accepted it with genuine delight. Then it will become the most important decoration I own." Emma laughed before hurrying off to join the other children decorating the Harvest Festival booths. I watched her disappear into the cheerful crowd before turning back to Luca. "She talks about this place every day," I admitted. "She says it feels like home." Luca looked around the busy courtyard where volunteers arranged blankets for families, children painted autumn leaves, and elderly neighbors shared coffee beneath colorful banners. "Maybe that is because everyone here matters to someone." We spent the rest of the morning preparing meals together. At one point, I struggled to lift a heavy box filled with canned food. Before I could ask for help, Luca quietly stepped beside me and carried the other side without saying a word. We moved through the hallway together, perfectly matching each other's pace until we reached the storage room. "You always seem to know when someone needs help," I said with a smile. He shrugged gently. "Someone once reminded me that noticing people is a choice." His answer stayed with me long after the box had been put away. Later that afternoon, Emma joined us carrying 3 cups of hot apple cider. "Break time," she declared, placing 1 cup into each of our hands. We sat together beneath the large maple tree while children laughed nearby. A cool breeze scattered colorful leaves across the grass, and Emma suddenly leaned against Luca's shoulder as naturally as though she had done it her whole life. He looked at me almost apologetically, uncertain whether he should move away. Instead, I simply smiled. "She only falls asleep beside people who make her feel safe." His expression softened. "That is a responsibility I will never take lightly." Emma closed her eyes for only a few peaceful minutes before waking with a sleepy smile and wrapping both of us in one spontaneous hug. We laughed quietly as she insisted that one hug worked better than 2 separate ones. Volunteers passing by smiled warmly at the simple scene before continuing their work. There were no cameras, no speeches, and no applause. Only ordinary people sharing an ordinary afternoon that somehow felt extraordinary. As the sun settled lower behind the trees, Luca and I walked Emma to the car. Before opening the passenger door, she looked back at both of us with the complete honesty only children possess. "I think happy people smile with their mouths," she said thoughtfully. "But people who really love each other smile with their eyes." Neither Luca nor I knew how to answer. We simply looked at one another, and for the first time since the gala, I realized the distance between us had quietly disappeared, replaced by something neither money nor power could ever create. By the time the first holiday lights appeared across the city, the community center had become the place where Emma and I spent nearly every free weekend. The building felt warmer than ever, filled with the smell of fresh soup from the kitchen, children's laughter echoing through the hallways, and volunteers decorating every corner with handmade ornaments instead of expensive decorations. One Saturday afternoon, while I helped organize winter coats for local families, I noticed 2 familiar faces walking through the front entrance. It took only a second to recognize them. The same 2 wealthy women from the charity gala stood near the reception desk wearing elegant coats and polished smiles. They had come as representatives of one of the event's major donors, surrounded by photographers and local reporters eager to capture generous public images. My hands froze for just a moment before I quietly returned to folding children's jackets. I had no interest in reopening old wounds. Emma noticed my expression immediately. "Mom," she whispered, "are you okay?" I smiled gently and squeezed her shoulder. "I am fine." Across the room, Luca had also seen them arrive. Unlike me, he never looked surprised. He simply continued speaking with several volunteers while calmly observing everything happening around him. The women eventually recognized me standing beside the donation tables. Their confident smiles faded for only an instant before returning. One of them approached with practiced elegance. "Well," she said lightly, "what a surprise seeing you here." I nodded politely. "Good afternoon." She glanced around the busy community center. "I hope there are no hard feelings about that unfortunate misunderstanding at the gala." Before I could answer, Emma stepped a little closer beside me and quietly slipped her hand into mine. I felt her small fingers tighten, but I remained calm. "I came here to help families," I replied softly, "not to revisit old conversations." The woman offered a smile that never quite reached her eyes before turning toward the photographers waiting nearby. She posed beside several donation boxes while thanking everyone loudly for supporting the community. I watched silently, refusing to let bitterness steal another moment from my daughter. A few minutes later, Luca walked onto the small stage prepared for the afternoon announcements. The room gradually became quiet. Volunteers, families, and guests gathered together while children settled into the front rows. Luca thanked everyone for their generosity before speaking about the importance of dignity. Kindness, he said, means very little if it only exists when cameras are watching. The room fell completely silent. He looked toward the audience with calm sincerity rather than accusation. The strongest people are not those with the most influence. They are the ones who choose respect even when no one expects it. His words were simple, yet their meaning reached everyone in the room. The two women shifted uncomfortably without hearing their names mentioned once. Luca never looked directly at them. He never embarrassed anyone publicly. He simply spoke about values that made empty appearances impossible to hide behind. When the applause finally filled the room, it came from volunteers, families, children, and ordinary people whose gratitude could never be purchased. I glanced toward Luca, and for a brief moment our eyes met across the crowded hall. He had not sought revenge for what happened beside the pool. He had done something far more powerful. He had allowed kindness, truth, and quiet integrity to speak louder than humiliation ever could. And standing there beside Emma, I realized that justice sometimes arrived not through anger, but through the simple courage of refusing to become like those who had once tried to diminish you. Winter settled gently over the city, wrapping rooftops in fresh snow and covering the community center with strings of warm white lights that reflected across the sidewalks every evening. Inside, every room buzzed with quiet purpose. Volunteers sorted winter coats, children decorated gingerbread cookies, and families gathered around long tables sharing homemade meals while holiday music played softly in the background. Emma insisted on helping every Saturday, proudly wearing a little volunteer badge that June had made especially for her. She greeted every family with the same bright smile, carefully handing children coloring books before leading them toward the craft tables. Watching her move through the crowded hall with so much confidence filled me with a kind of peace I had never known before. One afternoon, after we finished organizing donated toys, Luca asked if I had a few minutes to walk outside. The snowfall had finally stopped, leaving the gardens behind the community center sparkling beneath thousands of tiny lights. We followed the narrow stone path in comfortable silence until we reached a wooden bench overlooking a frozen pond. "There is something I have been thinking about," he said quietly. I waited without interrupting. He looked across the peaceful water before continuing. "For years I believed my responsibility ended with writing checks, funding programs, and solving problems from a distance." He smiled faintly. "Then you and Emma walked into this place, and suddenly none of that felt like enough anymore." I looked down at my gloved hands. "You were already helping people long before we met." "Maybe," he admitted, "but you reminded me that helping someone is not the same as knowing them." A gentle breeze carried snowflakes from the nearby trees, settling softly across the sleeves of our coats. We remained there for several quiet moments before Emma came running toward us holding 2 paper snowflakes she had carefully cut by hand. "These are for both of you," she announced proudly. One snowflake had my name written across the center. The other had Luca's. Before either of us could thank her, she laughed and taped both decorations side by side onto the wooden bench between us. "They belong together," she declared with complete certainty before skipping back toward the building. Luca and I exchanged amused smiles. "She has a remarkable way of simplifying life," he said. "Children usually do," I answered. We returned inside where volunteers were preparing the final boxes of food for delivery. As we loaded supplies into waiting vehicles, I noticed Luca quietly lifting the heaviest boxes while making certain every elderly volunteer carried only the lighter ones. Nobody asked him to do it. He simply noticed before anyone else did. That evening, after the last family had gone home, the community center felt wonderfully peaceful. The holiday lights continued glowing through the windows, while soft music echoed from the empty hall. I stood beside the entrance helping fold the final tablecloth when Luca walked over carrying my winter coat. Without a word, he gently placed it across my shoulders. His hand rested there for only a brief moment before he stepped back. "You always remember everyone else," he said softly. "Someone should remember you too." My heart grew unexpectedly quiet. I looked at him with a smile that needed no explanation. We left the building together beneath the falling snow, walking side by side toward the parking lot while the lights behind us reflected across the fresh white ground. For For the first time in many years, I no longer felt like someone struggling to survive one difficult week after another. Beside Luca, surrounded by people who cared for one another without expecting recognition, I finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere. And somehow that simple feeling had become the greatest gift either of us could have imagined. 1 year later, the same charity gala returned to the same magnificent estate, beneath the same crystal chandeliers, and beside the same shimmering pool where my life had quietly changed forever. The marble walkways still reflected the evening lights. The string quartet still played gentle music across the gardens, and elegant guests still arrived dressed in expensive gowns and tailored suits. Yet nothing felt the way it had before. This time I did not arrive carrying a silver tray or wearing a catering uniform. I walked through the front entrance wearing a simple ivory evening dress that Emma had proudly helped me choose weeks earlier. She skipped beside me holding my hand, smiling so brightly that every nervous thought disappeared the moment I looked at her. "Mom," she whispered excitedly. "This place looks different." I smiled softly. "No, sweetheart. We do." A black sedan quietly stopped beside the entrance a few seconds later. Luca stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his dark hair neatly combed, the familiar tattoos barely visible beneath crisp white cuffs. He walked toward us with the same calm confidence he carried everywhere, yet his smile belonged only to Emma and me. Without saying a word, he offered his hand. I accepted it naturally, realizing there had never really been a moment when our lives suddenly changed. They had simply grown together one ordinary day at a time. As we entered the ballroom together, conversations softened. Guests who had attended the previous year's gala recognized me almost immediately. Their expressions shifted from surprise to quiet respect. Across the courtyard, near the same pool where everything had begun, I noticed the two women who had once laughed while I climbed from the cold water. They looked toward us, then toward Luca, and finally lowered their eyes before offering polite greetings. There was no anger inside me anymore. Only gratitude that I no longer measured my worth by the opinions of people who had never truly known me. Luca greeted them with the same courtesy he showed everyone else before continuing toward the ballroom. He never mentioned the past. He did not need to. Time, truth, and character had already spoken more clearly than revenge ever could. Later that evening, the foundation announced its newest community expansion project, one that would provide additional childcare services, educational scholarships, and job training programs for single parents across the city. When the host invited me to say a few words about volunteering, I hesitated before stepping onto the small stage. Looking across the room, I saw volunteers from the community center, families whose lives had changed through the foundation, Walter and June smiling proudly from the front table, and Emma waving enthusiastically beside Luca. A year ago, I began quietly. I believed kindness often went unnoticed. I was wrong. Kindness changes people even when it takes time for the world to see it. The room remained completely silent. The greatest gift anyone ever gave me was not money or influence. It was dignity when I needed it most, and the chance to believe that compassion is stronger than humiliation. When I finished, the applause felt warm rather than overwhelming. As the evening came to an end, Luca and I walked outside toward the quiet pool, now glowing beneath the stars. The water reflected the moon so peacefully that it seemed impossible to imagine the painful memory it once held. He gently took both of my hands in his. "Do you know what I saw that night?" he asked softly. I smiled. "A woman who fell into a pool." He shook his head. "No. I saw the bravest heart in the entire room refuse to let cruelty define her." Emotion caught gently in my throat. I stepped closer and placed a tender kiss upon his cheek before he leaned forward and returned a gentle kiss that carried every promise neither of us needed to speak aloud. Emma called our names from the ballroom, laughing as she ran toward us beneath the glowing lights. We turned together to meet her, and as I looked back one final time at the calm water beside us, I realized that the place where someone had once tried to steal my dignity had quietly become the place where I found my family, proving that the most beautiful endings often begin with the hardest moments we choose to survive.